A lot of the time, cards aren't all that great by themselves. It often takes a specific combination of cards to make a truly broken strategy. It can often take years for a card to find their partners to allow them to become really broken. But people will often have their eyes on cards for quite a while before it gets that support. Today, we're going to go over a bunch of cards that, in the right circumstances, could be incredibly powerful. Starting us off at number 10, we have Rona, Herald of Invasion. This is a 1/3 legendary human wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the abilities where, whenever you cast a legendary spell, you untap Rona and then you can tap Rona to draw a card and then discard a card. It also has the ability where you can pay 5 and 1 Phyrexian black, which can be paid with black mana or 2 life, to transform Rona into Rona Tolarian Obliterator. This is a 5/5 Phyrexian wizard with trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to the defending player. It is the ability where, whenever a source deals damage to Rona, its controller exiles a card from their hand at random. If it's a land, you put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, you can cast that card for free. Now, the important part of this card is actually just the front side. This type of looter effect is great for your deck's consistency. Being able to use this effect multiple times in a single turn makes it incredible just ripping through your deck. What makes it so interesting and potentially really broken is the fact that cards like Mox Amber exist. Amber is a 0-mana legendary artifact that can be tapped to add 1 mana of any color amongst the colors in your legendary creatures and planeswalkers. So while you have a Rona out, this is just a Mox Sapphire with an upside, as it also lets you untap your Rona to dig further into your deck. So with Rona and Amber, you can rip through a ton of your deck, make extra mana, and potentially go off and win the game. Currently, there's not really a payoff for this kind of strategy. Kethis, the Hidden Hand, used to be used to loop Amber out of your graveyard to make tons of mana, and Rona would be amazing in that deck if Kethis weren't banned. If another card comes out, preferably another legendary creature, that allows you to loop cards out of your graveyard in a similar way to Kethis, this deck would almost certainly have legs in Pioneer. And Rona would be a great consistency boost for that deck. Now, why is this only at number 10? Well, Rona has already had some success in legendary-centric aggro decks in Standard, so it's not so much a card that might end up broken in the future, but rather a card that may be broken in a new way later on. And at number 9, we have Drannith Magistrate. This is a 1/3 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. It is an ability where your opponent can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hand. Magistrate has already seen some competitive play in sideboards to stop very specific strategies from going off, but the card isn't quite good enough for main board play. It's just not guaranteed that your opponent is going to be trying to cast spells from weird places. However, there are a few cards that make this ability a lot stronger. Cards like Urabrask Heretic Praetor make it so that whenever an opponent would draw a card for the first time on each of their turns, they instead exile the top card of their library, and they can play that card this turn. Now, if you have both Magistrate and Urabrask out at the same time, your opponent will be forced to skip their draw and then won't be able to play any of the cards they exiled, making this an effective lockout of your opponent drawing any more cards. There are a few cards that can do this in the game, but they all have an issue. They're kind of bad. Urabrask is just a bit too expensive for what it does, and it's one of the cheapest versions of this effect. There are a few other cards that synergize with Magistrate, like Elite Spellbinder, which makes playing Magistrate a more attractive proposition. With just a few more cards that work with Magistrate, it could start to see playing Death and Taxes style aggro decks not just as a sideboard card, but as a powerful lock piece. And at number 8, we have Diregraf Rebirth. This is a sorcery that costs 3, 1 black, and 1 green. It is an ability where it costs 1 less for each creature that died this turn, and the effect where you return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. It also has flashback for 5, 1 black, and 1 green. This allows you to cast it from your graveyard for its flashback cost, but you have to exile it afterwards. Reanimating creatures is a very powerful effect, and there are tons of great targets for Rebirth. The best one currently in Pioneer is Atraxa Grand Unifier. This is a 7/7 with 4 powerful keywords in the ability where, when it hits the field, you look at the top 10 cards in your library and then choose up to 1 of each card type among them to put them all into your hand. Then you ship the rest to the bottom of your deck. Atraxa is pretty crazy, so getting her out early will win you a lot of games. We already talked about a couple of creatures that mill you, so putting Atraxa in your graveyard isn't all that difficult. There are a few good ways to decrease your cost of Rebirth in a pinch as well. Cards like Nantuko Husk allow you to sacrifice your creatures for free. All you really need to do to make a fast Atraxa of this strategy is sack a couple of creatures on turn 4 and cast a Rebirth of 3 or so mana. Being able to cast it from your graveyard gives the deck much better long game as well, letting it play as a more versatile mid-range combo deck rather than just an all-in combo. Now, the main thing holding the card back is really the fact that there are other decks that do what it does, but faster, namely Greasefang Okiba Boss. This is a 4/3 for 3 that reanimates a vehicle at the beginning of your combat on your turn, gives it haste, and then bounces it to your hand at the end step. The best partner for this card is Parhelion 2, a 5/5 vehicle with a crew 4 that makes 2 4/4 angels with vigilance and flying that are attacking whenever it attacks. To crew a vehicle, all you need to do is tap creatures you control with a power equal to or greater than its crew cost, meaning Greasefang can put Parhelion into play, give it haste, and crew it all by herself. While this is less value than Rebirthing and Atraxa, the damage it puts on board is so overwhelming it will end most games right there. The existence of another graveyard-focused deck makes the meta less welcoming to any sort of Rebirth deck, since people will even be more focused on playing lots of graveyard hate than normal. The fact that there's a slightly more consistent version of the deck running around makes playing any Rebirth deck a pretty risky proposition. That's not the end of the line for Rebirth, however, as good creatures are far more common than good vehicles. Rebirth will likely age a lot better than Greasefang has, so as more powerful creatures get printed and you have a better toolbox to choose from, the deck will only get better. And at number 7, we have Reconstruct History. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2, 1 red, and 1 white. It is the effect where you return up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target enchantment, up to 1 target instant, up to 1 target sorcery, and up to 1 target planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. Then you exile Reconstruct History. So a card that can be a 5-for-1 is obviously a pretty tantalizing prospect. The issue is having a deck with this many different types of cards in your graveyard. You're also not likely to play with any self-mill strategy, since all you get from Reconstruct is a lot of card advantage. It's not really worth hurting the card quality of your deck for a mere card advantage, which is why most self-mill strategy payoffs have cards that do something a bit unfair. While there isn't a home for it right now, it's not that unlikely there will be someday. Any red-white mid-range deck that needs some extra card advantage will at least be looking over the card, especially since there are already so many great targets for most of its abilities. Fable the Mirrorbreaker is one of the best cards in Pioneer, and it was terrorizing Standard right up until it was recently banned on top of seeing some play in other formats. There are tons of powerful artifact creatures like Hangerback Walker that a mid-range deck might be interested in, and there are tons of great planeswalkers in red and white, such as the Wandering Emperor and Chandra, Torch of Defiance. Instants and sorceries are the easiest types of cards to put into graveyard, so getting those back is a foregone conclusion. Currently, the best mid-range deck in Pioneer is Black-Red, but the meta can always change. If a red-white based mid-range deck ever does come to prominence, Reconstruct is a great candidate for a 1 or 2 of to help in long games, and it'll probably end up being pretty backbreaking into those matchups that it's good in. And at number 6, we have Kykar Wind's Fury. This is a 3/3 legendary bird wizard with a mana cost of 1, 1 blue, 1 red, and 1 white. It has flying and the abilities where, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. It also has the ability where you can sacrifice a spirit to add 1 red mana. This card has several very strong abilities. The ability to sacrifice a creature to create mana has proven itself to be incredibly strong on cards like Skirk Prospector, as it has the ability to make 1/1 tokens when you cast spells on cards like Young Pyromancer. Putting both of these abilities into the same card only makes them more powerful. Not only can you cast spells to amass a ton of value by making creatures, being able to trade those in for mana whenever you need them allows you to be incredibly flexible with your plays. Any non-creature spell you cast will generate a ton of additional value, and that you can make sure you use it however is most pertinent at any given moment. Despite all this power, Kykar hasn't ever really seen any play. The thing is, 4 mana is a lot to pay for a card, and a 4 mana card that doesn't immediately do something is pretty high risk. All the value the card gives you doesn't matter if it's just removed before you untap. Still, the dies to removal argument has never completely stopped a card from seeing play. If a shell that wanted both mana and token generation came around, Kykar would be the only card able to fill both of those roles simultaneously. Having such a unique combination of abilities means that Kykar is far more likely to have a resurgence down the line than a lot of the other cards that are similarly powerful. And at number 5, we have Chandra's Incinerator. This is a 6/6 elemental with a mana cost of 5 and 1 red. It has abilities where it costs X less to cast, where X is the amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponent this turn. It has Trample, and whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Incinerator deals that much damage to target planeswalker or creature that player controls. Incinerator is a very powerful card whenever it actually works. It can be very inconsistent, as you need to draw a couple of cheap, effective burn spells alongside it to be able to actually cast it. There are a few formats where this is possible, but Incinerator isn't good enough there. It has been tried out in burn decks in Modern, and while it does make those decks more powerful, it also makes them a lot less consistent. Hitting a 6/6 trample that also cleans up your opponent's board is extremely powerful. But it's an awful top deck in the late game and requires you to have just a few too many specific cards at the right time to get in play. You could try to make Incinerator more consistent in these decks, but doing so would slow them down too much. Modern is a really powerful format, and decks will just roll you over if you give them too much time to get off the floor. However, in a weaker format, this card could work a lot better. The issue there is that there aren't quite enough good burn spells to enable Incinerator. The best burn spells available in Pioneer are Boros Charm and Skewer the Critics, and Skewer needs you to deal damage to your opponent with another card before you can use it to decrease Incinerator's cost. If a few more good burn spells were printed in something like Pioneer or Historic, Incinerator could see some real play as a finisher for a burn deck. And at number 4, we have Acererak the Archlich. This is a 5/5 legendary zombie wizard with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It has abilities where, whenever it enters the battlefield, if you haven't completed the Tomb of Annihilation, you bounce it back to your hand and venture into the dungeon. It also has the ability where, whenever it attacks, for each opponent you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token unless that player sacrifices a creature. The first ability is the only one that really matters here. To understand this card, we need to talk about dungeons. There are 3 dungeons in Magic: Tomb of Annihilation, Lost Mines of Pandelver, and the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Whenever you venture into the dungeon, if you're not in one of those dungeons, you choose whichever one you want to enter and start in the first room, triggering that effect. Each time you venture into a dungeon from then on, you go into the next room and get that effect until you complete the dungeon and go back to square one. The idea behind Acererak is that it's a very overpowered creature for its cost, but requires you to do a little side quest before it can work, specifically going through the shortest of the 3 dungeons. Of course, as soon as people saw the card, they realized that they could simply not go into the Tomb of Annihilation, and instead just use Acererak as a 3-mana creature that would bounce itself to your hand infinitely, something that no other card does. If you do manage to recast Acererak an infinite number of times, this will just win you the game, since one of the rooms in the Lost Mine, the Dark Pool, has the effect to drain 1 life from your opponent. People immediately recognize this as the best thing to do with Aluren. Aluren is a very broken card that lets both players cast creatures that cost 3 or less for free and at instant speed, which has led to multiple combos over the years. However, these combos usually require multiple cards, whereas Aluren and Acererak just wins right there. Unfortunately, Aluren is only legal in Legacy, and Legacy is such a broken format that it isn't good enough there. That hasn't stopped people from trying to break Acererak in other formats though. All you need to do is just find some way to get 3 mana each time you cast Acererak to reduce its cost to get a bit less mana, and there are more ways to make this work than you might think. Cards like Relic of Legends and Gwenna, Eyes of Gia can both be tapped for mana and can untap themselves when you cast an Acererak, letting you loop it over and over if you have both of them on the field. While this isn't good enough for any format right now, as more and more cards like this get printed, the deck will only get more consistent and powerful. Eventually, someone will probably find a way to loop Acererak in a weaker format than Legacy's that's fast and consistent enough to be a real deck. And at number 3, we have Prime Speaker Vannifar. This is a 2/4 Elf Ooze Wizard with a mana cost of 2, 1 green and 1 blue. It is an ability where you can tap it and sacrifice another creature to search your library for another creature card with a mana value of 1 plus the sacrifice creature's mana value, put it into the battlefield, and then shuffle. As soon as this card was announced, people were excited for it. This is essentially a creature version of Birthing Pod, a card that was banned in the modern format, and while Vannifar has a few downsides, the effect is still very powerful. The main difference between the 2 cards and the thing holding Vannifar back is that it has Summoning Sickness. Having to wait an extra turn was more than enough to stop the card from breaking into Modern, but there are still a few formats where brewing with the card might prove fruitful. The main suspects would be Pioneer and Explorer/Historic, as these are the only formats where she's not outclassed by Birthing Pod existing. There are a few ways that people have found to make untapping with Vannifar enough to win the game. Corridor Monitor is a 2-mana creature that untaps a creature when it enters the battlefield. There are a few cards such as Renegade Rallier and Extraction Specialist that can return to the battlefield whenever they enter the field. Since they both cost 3 mana, you can sack Corridor Monitor to Vannifar to find one of these creatures, get the monitor back, untap Vannifar, and repeat the process. Each loop nets you another one of your 3-drop creatures. All you have to do is just find some sort of haste enabler, and you can kill your opponent right there. The issue with this combo is that it requires running a lot of these cards in your deck in order to pull it off, restricting the total deck space of the combo. It's also a graveyard combo, and most forms of graveyard hate will stop you right in your tracks. Birthing Pod had a lot more versatility back in the days when it was good in Modern, able to simply find 2-card infinites or more powerful value-based creatures to stall for time. Vannifar is the kind of card that will most likely get better as these formats grow, giving it more combos to try and put together and more value targets to tutor up for certain matchups. If a more succinct, tight creature-based combo is printed into one of these formats, Vannifar will likely prove a powerful consistency enabler for these decks. And at number 2, we have Sundial of the Infinite. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It is the ability where you can pay 1 and tap it to end the turn, but you can only activate this ability during your own turn. Ending the turn is one of the most powerful effects in all of Magic. When you end the turn, all spells and abilities on the stack just stop. If it's during combat, combat just won't happen. Even better, things that would trigger at the beginning of the end step can't trigger because the turn simply ends immediately. Limiting you to only doing this on your turn does hurt the card a lot, but there are a ton of ways to make use of the effect. For example, one of the best cards to use alongside Sundial the Infinite is a card like Final Fortune. This card gives you an extra turn for only 2 mana, but you lose the game at the beginning of that turn's end step. However, if you end the turn with the ability to kill you on the stack using Sundial, you'll live since the ability didn't resolve. There are a total of 3 separate cards with this effect at 2 mana, Final Fortune, A Last Chance, and Warrior's Oath. However, all of these cards are only legal in formats like Legacy, Vintage, and Commander, very powerful formats where this type of combo isn't quite good enough. In Modern, you use Sundial alongside Alchemist's Gambit, a version of Final Fortune that costs 3 mana, and Glorious End, a 3-mana instant that ends the turn but kills you at the end of your next turn. The 1 extra mana here is also enough to slow it down enough for Modern, and Sundial isn't legal in Pioneer. If Final Fortune gets a reprint in Modern, people will immediately begin testing to see how good Sundial is. It's worth mentioning that this is only the most extreme use of Sundial. There are tons of other ways to abuse ending your turn early. For example, you can draw 3 cards off of Ideas Unbound, and then skip having to discard the 3 cards at the end of your turn. There's no telling what kind of card could get printed that Sundial could be used to break in the future. And at number 1, we have Defiler of Instinct. This is a 4/4 Phyrexian Kavu with a mana cost of 2 and 2 red. It has First Strike, meaning it deals combat damage before creatures without First Strike. It is the ability where you can pay 2 life as an additional cost to cast red permanent spells, and those spells cost 1 red less to cast if you pay life this way. This effect only reduces the colored mana of a card's cost. Its last ability lets you deal 1 damage to any target anytime you cast a red permanent spell. Defiler of Instinct is here representing the entire Defiler cycle. A group of cards that allow you to pay life to reduce the colored cost of permanent spells of their color, and give you a payoff whenever you cast a permanent spell of that color. The entire cycle is very interesting, as reducing the cost of your spells like this is an extremely powerful effect. This is all on top of the fact that the triggers they give you are also just really powerful in and of themselves. These cards do have a few limiting factors on them already. You can only reduce the cost of a spell by 1, and paying life does mean using them to storm off isn't really viable without some way to gain life back. Even with these restrictions, it's very possible the deck will find a way around this at some point. For example, if you have an Augur of Autumn to let you cast creatures from the top of your deck alongside a couple of cards like Impassioned Orator that gain you life when a creature enters a battlefield under your control, you can just cast a ton of spells from the top of your library. You could even skip the Augur if you're combining this with the Defiler of Dreams, and a lot of 1 blue creatures, since Dreams draws you a card when you cast a blue spell. Now, these cards aren't likely to ever actually be used as an all-in combo strategy, as there are just a few too many hoops to jump through. However, a lot of the cards you'd want to play to enable them are already really good cards. Augur of Autumn is just a really powerful card advantage engine, and the Defilers do a lot of powerful things all on their own. Pinging something with Instinct whenever you cast a red spell is great. Pumping your whole board with Vigor can end a game fast, and do I really need to explain why drawing cards off of Dreams is so good? Even if you can only cast 2 or 3 cards in a row with them, the value that gives you can be completely insurmountable. The cards are mostly just waiting for a deck that's fine with running a lot of permanent spells that cost exactly 1 of their respective color, so you can free cast them all. Once that shell comes around, the Defiler of that color will almost certainly start seeing play to give the deck some truly unfair turns. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any ideas for cards you think are very close to being broken, which you probably do, leave a comment down below. If you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments as well.